Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 534th episode of Constructed Criticism. I am your host, Mason Clark. Spencer is out this week, and I am here with Abe Stein. Abe, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty fantastic. How about you, Mason?
I'm doing okay. It's a busy time of the year with holiday stuff, and I'm still in car fiasco land for anyone who knows on Twitter. But you know what? Tomorrow's supposed to be a big day when it comes to that, so I'm hopeful and positive it's going to be a good time.
Do you have any? So you're gonna get your car back tomorrow, ideally.
Well, so I have my car back, but the thing is, there's something that only like the dealership can really fix with it. And they couldn't take my car until tomorrow, the time of this recording, so the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. So I'm gonna take my car to them in the morning, and then they're gonna give me a loaner car. And then I'm hopeful. They basically said, obviously, the holidays are going to slow things down, so I'll probably get my car back Monday instead of like normally it would be Friday, just because they have less people on hand.
So you're
Uh,
gonna get to do donuts in like the loaner car from the dealership
yeah,
on
I'm gonna get like
Thanksgiving.
the '97 Civic or whatever, and I'm gonna go do the holidays with the family. It's gonna be fun. But you know what
So
else is gonna be fun? Reviewing our VODs, and that is going to be the main topic for today's episode. This is a pretty important thing when it comes to improving at Magic long term, and we're just gonna hop right into it here. Abe, when we say VOD review, what exactly are we saying when we talk about this?
yeah, I mean, when we talk about reviewing like a VOD or really like watching replays of your matches, it's about what it sounds like. It's going back and taking the time to rewatch the games that you've already played on Arena Ladder and you recorded them locally to your computer, or you streamed them on Twitch and saved the VOD, be it using the replay tool on Magic Online or using the same kind of recording software method for that, but taking the time to look at the games that you've already played, not like necessarily immediately after you play them, but just setting aside time to do that and reflect on the decisions you made. And is there anything you maybe would have done differently with a different perspective, and using that as a tool to reflect and grow as a player.
Yeah, and I really want to hit on a big part of what you said there that I think can easily go under the radar, which is like I want to reflect on what happened and try to improve. And I think that like if you don't have the curiosity to ask yourself like what did I like I did this, what could I have done instead, right? Or maybe at the beginning of it being like, okay, I think I want to, let's say, play Preacher of the Schism and then not attack this turn. And then you watch a little of the VOD and past you ends up, activating your creature land and attacking. Like ask yourself, like, okay, I kind of thought this before. I think this now. Why? What's different? What do I think is right? What makes the most sense with the game at hand? I'm removed myself a little bit from the game. I'm stepping back. And if you don't have that curiosity to ask those questions, it's going to be a lot harder. And if you find yourself doing route review currently, and you don't have that innate curiosity, that innate like, what am I supposed to be doing here? It is probably the reason why you don't get as much out of VOD reviews as you could be, or feel like maybe you don't, which is a huge piece of feedback we hear from a lot of people and kind of what sparked this episode in a way.
Yeah, I think back to when I first started doing this and making this a part of my routine, and like it wasn't until I had a group of players who I was playing with online, like specifically like Jonathan Sekenic being the first person who I really ever would like play matches with while they were like watching over my shoulder, or like screen sharing on Discord or Google Hangouts at the time, like talking through the decisions I'm making at the time. But even from that, like that was easy at times. Just like, okay, I want to learn how to play this deck better, or like I want to do this, and this is my goal, and so I'm playing with a goal. And I think that oftentimes, I know I hear it a lot in coaching too, players feel like they don't have necessarily those resources to like have a friend who'll sit there through an entire Magic Online league, or through like the same 2 hours that I have at night to play Magic Online or Magic Arena, that they don't. And I think that VOD review is a really good opportunity to not only align your practice with your goals in another way that can take in some ways less time. Like you can watch Twitch VOD like from your phone at work for like half an hour. Like there are ways to squeeze it into your time, but also it's something you can get your like you can set times and get your network people you're working with, players your LGS or friends of yours from, however you know each other who might maybe aren't easily accessible in the same way, to look over things in the same way that, I do with my coaching clients. I know you do with yours, and really taking the time to dig into all the decisions that were made, like getting an additional perspective and trying to find like where it is you could play even better. Maybe not even talking about turning a loss into a win, but turning a win into an even more certain win. And I think that there's just so much that's important about being intentional about your practice. That's important to remember. At VOD review specifically is like the vehicle for the most intentionality. Like you will get the most, I think, out of in the way you can't when you play with someone at the same time, right? There's time constraints, there's a moto clock, there's arena like rope. Everyone's kind of thinking the same things. You're talking to each other through every decision, but when you watch a game from someone else's perspective, or that someone else played and made the decisions on their own, like you have so much opportunity to see the game played through different eyes and learn. And I think it's just, I can't stress enough how important this is like a non-negotiable piece of your process. If you're trying to be a player who's improving, that you take the time to reflect.
Yeah, I agree full-heartedly, and I think it is something, like you said there, that it has to become a part of the process. If you're not eventually getting to this point, it is going to be, I don't want to say impossible to like make big strides and big improvements. It is going to be significantly harder than it needs to be. Maybe a better way to look at this is like you can climb the mountain, go the whole way, or you can take the elevator up a couple flights. Like you can make it a little easier on yourself. And I think it is so, so important for that. I do want to mention one thing that you said during the process, which was like maybe it can be really hard to find time for a friend. And what we're going to talk about today is all stuff you can do on your own or with a friend, unless we kind of say otherwise, right? And in that regard, I have had this challenge in the past with coaching clients where, we review kind of the whole game almost always. Eventually, sometimes things go so off the rails that we'll stop the review. And we'll kind of move on to the next game, right? Because like maybe we made some error that was like really bad because we didn't understand the deck, and that had cascading effects, and we're kind of wasting our time. And I never really knew how to like frame it to them or to other people. But recently, during my League of Legends adventures, I have found these people that do League content, and they do VOD reviews as part of their process too, because it turns out the thing that you do in lots of games that can be very helpful. And they had this thing that they call end of review, which is basically like, hey, you've made such an important mistake. We need to go work on that. Don't let's not even keep watching. Let's just stop and move on to the next VOD, or go let's figure out how we're going to tackle this problem. Right. Which I think is like a very interesting idea and a great way to maybe like potentially save time if you're with your friends. Right. Like if let's say you don't counter Enduring Innocence or whatever, in the matchup where that's the best and most important card and your deck can't answer it besides counter spells. Well, we've learned something, we moved on. Obviously, there's probably something you could still learn from that game as it continues, but for the sake of time, there can be those moments where maybe you're a bit more strict with it than we're going to mention here, and I just wanted to mention that, and you brought it up kind of perfectly earlier, so I plan to do that at the end. We're mentioning it now, a little awkward, but let's hop in to sort of the idea of VOD reviewing, what you should do, and one of the most important things that comes up with clients, and I'm really curious, Abe, your opinion on this, because I never heard you mention it, but my clients always go like, well, I won a lot of the games, but I lost this one, right? And so they want to show me the loss. And what I always tell people is you should review both wins and losses. Just because you won the game does not mean that there's nothing you can't do. And in fact, Abe, some of my favorite like VOD review sessions ever in coaching were people who come to me and they're like, Mason, I only won. I just won every game. And it's like, well, great, let's review some of those, and we sit down and we look, and there are still mistakes and things that we can improve on. Almost always. I don't know if I've ever done a VOD review with somebody, like a session, and, watch a couple games where they won all of them, and there wasn't, at minimum, a real error, let alone like little micro errors, right? Like maybe we mistapped our lands, we missequenced a little stuff like that. It's not the end of the world, but is important. These are all things you can learn from both wins and losses. And so you should be sort of indiscriminately looking over your matches.
Yeah, I've definitely had a lot of times where clients be like, oh yeah, I want to watch this game, and they'll like pull up their match from a league, and like, yeah, I lost one, but I think I could have won it. And those are really great ones to review, you know? Like, and I think it's important, and you feel like, you know, you're dedicating this time to watching yourself play Magic. So you want to make sure you're watching the games that, like, you know, you see a loss, you want to turn that into a win. You know, what you're saying is absolutely correct. The opportunity to play better is there in your wins and your losses. And sometimes in your losses, they're not that interesting. Like, how many games have you lost ever to, oh, I just didn't draw my third land, and then the game snowballed because I, you know, or like, well, my opponent just like had, you know, had the perfect curve, and my draw didn't really line up, and so I lost. So it's like, okay, there's not much to see there, but let me see the other match in this league. Let me see, you know, so we saw this happen. Or like a lot of times, like, oh, game 2, like they had a sideboard card I didn't expect. I'm like, okay, well, let's watch game 3. How did you play with that in mind? How did we adapt, you know, to what we had seen, and what were the decisions we made in the context of the whole match? Because it is important to take that time to do it, because when you think about it, when you're playing, I mean, playing online, playing in paper, all of your games are an opportunity to win or lose, and all of them involve making decisions. So, you know, it's in fact often the wins where you have your worst habits, because like, and that never get addressed. Like, if you're someone who is really good at playing from behind, like, that's going to turn a lot of your losses into wins. But if you're someone who's not good at playing from ahead, then there might be a lot of games you wind up losing that, like, winning because your deck gets ahead and you're good with that, but like, you get ahead and then you kind of, it slips, or you give your opponent windows you don't even notice that don't wind up getting capitalized on necessarily. But, you know, you're letting games slip there. And so it is really important. And I think that it is definitely not just you who has glides that are like, yeah, we need to, like, I just can't believe it. I don't need to look at anything. I just keep on winning until I lose. I'm just gonna keep on playing. And it's like, well,
sometimes you gotta step back and look over it for sure. So coming into this, I do think one thing to say as we start talking about the process is understand that VOD review should take, you know, probably longer, if not as long as the match did, lots of times, especially in situations where the game is complicated, right? There are going to be some games and some things where you're going to be able to catch it very quickly, and maybe you kind of move through things and it's very simple, and it was one error that cascaded, or you did really well, made an error and got punished hard. But for the most part, understand that this is an important use of your time. Like, this is going to take a lot of your time, but it is an important use. And, you know, really believe that, like, we really believe that this is a very fruitful endeavor, and it's okay that it's taking so much time, because you're gonna, in theory, get way more out of this than you're gonna do getting like 5 hours of Arena Ladder, right? It's just a way more time efficient way to go about things.
Yeah, and I think to expound on that, Mason, like, you know, we're talking about what, you know, doing this VOD review is really valuable. What does that look like? I've played games where it's really hard to tell whether or not I should have attacked, or like if an Alpha Strike would have been good here or not, and I'm worried about the constraints of the clock, or playing around something, or like, what does combat look like if, you know, my opponent has this, or like has a trick or a removal spell, or doesn't have this. And in those moments, I have to make a decision based on, you know, what it is I know, what it is I believe in that moment. I don't have all the information, but ultimately I'm going to come to a decision that is hopefully the best one. But there's a lot that I didn't necessarily know. Now, what a VOD review allows me to do is to stop at that, like, look at all the turns that led up to that board state, identify if there were places where maybe I could have, like, changed the texture of the game so I didn't get so gridlocked, or maybe I didn't have such a complicated decision, or on the turn of that complicated decision, where there's a lot of things I could do, I can run through, like, by hand, just think through every permutation of what my options were. I mean, this could be as simple as, you know, in like a limited VOD review, I know that in the Discord I'd done a couple of these with people who had posted them, of just looking over like their question and watching their game and the 17 lands replay and saying, oh yeah, I think like this is the right attack, and they asked, oh, how'd you come to that? And it was just, well, I looked at how many, like, I looked at all the attacks I could make and what the best blocks were, and I realized that this is the one that I think is best for these reasons, and then listed, this is what happens if I do A, this is what happens if I do B, this is what happens if I do C, and so of these outcomes, play B is the one that looks the best to me. And being able to do that for complicated decisions, for ones that don't have perfect information or even like very good information, but maybe you wind up getting blown out by something because they actually do have the removal spell. By watching the VOD, you can even go back to the start of that game again and say, should I have known maybe that they had this card? It gives you the opportunity to think on all the questions you could be asking yourself during a game of Magic that maybe you don't have the mental bandwidth to in the moment, or you don't have the time to answer in the moment, or that you should be asking but haven't really taken the time to answer because it's too cumbersome, or you weren't on top of it in that moment and you weren't playing your absolute best. But it gives you a space, like a real sandbox to think through absolutely anything and everything that comes to mind and determine what was the best play. Because a lot of the times, and this is like, there'll be players who I either test with or who I do coaching with who will say, oh yeah, I looked at the VOD afterwards and like, I don't think there's anything I could have done. And look at it and I'll say, well, you're saying that thinking that you made all the plays right already. Let's talk about all the plays you made. Even if you came to the same conclusion and that was correct, what are the merits of all the other plays? Because sometimes it could be if you were so set that that they have a counter spell in their hand, a removal spell in their hand. It's like, well, are we choosing to play around that? Or maybe we should have done something that made them use it earlier in the game, right? Maybe we should have played out a creature sooner so it would die to their Doomblade. And then your next thing lives, and that's the actual important card, right? There are tons of things that you can spend the time to look at, and when you really sit there and do the work of that, and I think especially in Standard right now, there's a ton of opportunity for that. If you've played any of the mid-range mirrors, and I'm sure you'll back me up on this, Mason, but like, especially with creature lands and Fountain Port, you have lands in play that give you 4 different options on what you could do. Like you could be leaving mana up to represent something and a block, or you could be attacking and spending all your mana doing that on any given turn. And like, is that better or worse? Like, there's so many things that you might not consider or might not be considering. And taking the time to even just do that and actually exhaust all of your options and write it out for yourself, like that can be more valuable than anything. And I think like reviewing your VOD and taking the time to watch that replay and do that, it opens your eyes to so many plays that you might not have even thought about prior. I know that when I was playing like a long time ago, playing Jeskai Control with like Mystical Teachings and Lingering Souls back when like Jeskai Nahiri was a deck, that was the first time I ever really played Control in Modern. And if it weren't for taking the time to review the games I'd played with someone who had that knowledge and expertise on the archetype and the format, like I would have not been able to understand half the plays I would have been able to make in spots, and I would have like completely closed myself off to lines that I just hadn't considered. So I think it can't be overstated how important it is to take it seriously, and that what it looks like sometimes feels goofy of like, I'm going to sit here for an hour and like write out, like type out on a notepad or write out on a piece of paper, like what were the different lines and outcomes, and then kind of look at them and judge what I think is best. But when you play game Magic, that's what you do in, kind of a, like, comparatively in a split decision in a moment compared to like all of the work that goes into that. And I think it's a really good exercise for that reason too.
Yep, I agree. I think it is of the utmost importance, and I think like that goes back to that form of curiosity, right? Like if you're not willing to ask those questions and really dig deep into this, you're not going to get anywhere, right? Or at least not anywhere efficiently. I think sort of a thing I want to add to that as well, of like working through all this stuff and trying to figure out what's best. You might be asking yourself this question of like, well, how am I going to know if it's right or not? And the answer is, especially if you're by yourself, you're not going to know for sure. But your goal is to come to the best conclusion you can, to like think critically, challenge yourself, right? Work it out. And then now you've hopefully gotten better at that process a little bit. And over time, that'll improve and improve and improve. You'll, have chances to interact with other players. You have chances to learn from them, whether you're like interacting one on one or watching a stream or a video, and your process will improve over time. And, maybe you'll just talk to someone after a match, right? Like maybe I'll VOD review some of my games and be like, oh, I really think, Into the Flood Maw is the best bounce spell for my Beans deck. And then I play against Abe at an RCQ, and, Abe's playing green black, and I like play, and my Flood Maws are fine. We talk after the match, and Abe's like, yeah, how many like unsummons did you have? Because I found like when I was playing my games and looking over them, that would be this huge blowout where they would unsummon like their Eddie Merc crab and then reflash it down. And then, I would like lose these combat scenarios. Like you might have things like that occur, but you kind of need to do the work and start thinking more critically and working through those. And I do want to also like highlight when we're talking about this VOD review, on MTGO, it saves all of your games. If you play it on the computer, it will be on that computer, I think, for like 100 matches or so. You just have to go to the settings in the corner. And if you're on Arena, there's nothing like that inherent to the program. I believe 17 Lands tracks the limited games, and I think it does Constructed as well, but don't quote me on that. You can also just OBS record your games and then watch them back. And when we say watch them back, like, just to be clear, what we're saying is like play, pause, think. It is not just like let it play out really quickly and you're watching, a SCG feature match or something. It is much more critical and scientific in the process.
Yeah, this is like the NFL film review of Magic. It's like you're watching every play break down and thinking like, okay, what is the best decision I could make here? Or like depending on what it is you're trying to get out of your VOD review, like you were saying there, Mason, like you could be sitting there like saying, what would make my deck better? Like what is a card I wish I could draw in these spots? Should I be playing this card in my sideboard or this card in my sideboard? Let me look at some games I've played and think about what that card would look like in the texture of those games I've played. That can be a totally great use of your time reviewing a VOD. It doesn't have to be how well did I play. It's just that's typically for so many players, myself included, there's so much opportunity always in technical play to gain edges and to play cleaner. And 99%, like getting to a top 1% player, like being someone who's, crushing it at the RCQ level, making deep runs at the RC, qualifying for Pro Tours, like the first 99% of that, I believe, just comes from technical play most of the time. Like technical play with a stock deck, you will get very, very far if you're playing that well. So, like that's why we say that. But at a level of preparing for Pro Tours or really taking even something like an RC seriously and brewing, there's a ton of avenues to look at the whole picture of the information that you have, because every game is just data, and you can learn so much from it if you ask good questions and use the information to think in the aggregate. I think that unsummoning your Eddie Merc crab example is perfect. Of like if you never ask that question of what would be better, or like what do I need here? It's like, oh, I wish I could have tapped their creature. Well, or like save my guy from a removal spell. Well, there you go. Like the Into the Flood Maw in your hand wouldn't be able to do that, but you could play a card that does. And it's a huge way to enable yourself to improve, which is, of course, always the point of the show, because it's something that gives you a space to just think about what could be different. I think that when you think about what could be different, it's where you get the most gain in what can be better.
Just really quickly before we move on, I want to highlight, you should think what you could do different. That does not mean what you did was the wrong thing, right? It is not like, oh, I'm an idiot, I did all these things wrong. It is about it's like kind of questioning and taking this time now that we are removed from the match a little bit and we get to sit down and really think about what is fully available to me. And this can, that's where like the education, the learning came from. And also kind of like in the unsummon example, might give you a great idea on a card, right? Like you just mentioned, I really wish that I wasn't getting beaten down right now. Maybe that figures out some card where, God, this graveyard card was so annoying. Maybe I should be playing a Ghost Vacuum or something, right? It can lead to lots of improvements beyond just your play. The last thing that I really want to talk about is sort of working VOD review into your practice time. So I think I always really tell people in coaching is like, figure out how much time you can realistically practice Magic, right? And like kind of give it your full attention. There's nothing wrong with playing Magic for fun, like maybe you just want to play Arena. Like, I think I've talked about the show a lot. I've played a lot of Magic Arena, like while watching CW shows on Netflix. You can't watch all of the Flash, Abe, and play as much Magic as I do unless you double up a little bit. That's not like
Oh,
my best practice, right? And I know that. And when I'm practicing for something, that's not how I do it. So when it comes to like giving yourself the time, figure out how much time you have. And for the sake of this example, Abe, let's just say we have 5 hours a week that we can really hard dedicate to practicing Magic, spread across, the course of a week. With that in mind, I highly suggest at first you do 80-20 of playing to VOD review. So in this example, it would be 4 hours of playing, 1 hour of VOD review. Doesn't have to all be at once, but that's kind of the goal. And then as time goes on, I really want to get closer to 50-50. And just sort of as you feel more comfortable doing it, it becomes kind of a thing that you practice, especially if you have other people you can do it with. You want that to become a bigger part of it. And I always tell people too is if you feel like you played a match and you're like, God, that one got away from me, I always suggest like pulling it up. And I've done that a lot on Modo. I feel like I messed that game up and I immediately pull it up after the match. I just like, let's watch the replay. I got to figure out what went wrong here or whatever. But I really like is taking some time to remove yourself from the game so you're not as biased towards the decisions you already made, right? In the moment, you might be really thinking something because of the way they played, or maybe a bluff they sold, right? And giving yourself some time to sort of, maybe not remember the game as fully would be as invested, lets you kind of approach it more impartially. So what I really suggest is kind of in that like 5 hour example, let's say you're playing for the first 3 hours of your time during the course of the week. On the fourth hour, we VOD review, right? The first hour of gameplay. And then we go and we play the fifth hour, right? That's kind of my suggestion, then weaving that in to be more 50-50-ish as we get better and better at it. That was sort of my stuff for this. I think we've covered a lot of it. Abe, is there anything you wanted to say about the topic before we wrap things up here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that everything you said there was really good. I think that building a gradual process to incorporating it is important because you kind of need to do both, right? You can't have VODs to review if you don't play, but the review is really important. So, if you play, 80-20 in your first week, eventually you'll build up a backlog that you have matches, but also, don't be afraid to make it, like a testing night in your Discord of friends, or like, setting aside a time on the weekends or whatever to say, hey guys, let's just hop in a call, or, like bring a laptop to the LGS, and between rounds, or, after FNM, like let's all bring a couple of games to look at, and like either screen share them in Discord, or if you all have recorded them and stream them on Twitch, like pull up all the videos and get people involved to get additional perspectives. And it helps a lot with the work of, especially if you feel like you can't identify what the alternatives were. It gives you just additional perspectives on that and help in kind of thinking out loud on what was important and what's most important. What of the outcomes is most preferable? Because there are going to be times where you might disagree with someone who you think is whose opinion is really valuable to you, and you get to learn a lot about what matters to them, and incorporate that aspect of their philosophy and understanding of the game into your own. So definitely do it. Definitely do it. But also it's not just about something that you have to sit there and be like, sorry guys, I can't come hang out because I have to sit around and watch my old Magic Online VODs. It can be something that's really fun and engaging. It's something that I find to be one of the best parts of my current play group, is just how much we get to bird each other and watch each other and talk through each other's matches. And it can be the best part of yours too.
That's going to do it for this week's main topic. You can always check out other people in the Discord via patreon.com/ccmtg. We have a Discord full of patrons of the show, very like-minded, and if you're looking for someone to do VOD review, you might be able to find someone in there who's in a similar spot to you, right? I know plenty of people who are sort of living in a place where there's maybe not a lot of people locally to them to Magic, or they just moved and, now the time zones are different. You might be able to find someone there. And if you want to support the show, it could be a great 2-for-1 there. Check out patreon.com/ccmtg. Support the show. one of the benefits of being a patron, Abe, is you get to ask a patron question. This week's Patreon question comes from Searing Blaze, and it is: everyone has a certain archetype that they are more comfortable with. How do you get out of the mindset that you are an aggro player, mid range player, etc.? And we picked this one because I think, we both agree on this, that I believe one of the biggest traps that someone falls into is what you're describing right now, Searing Blaze, which is, hey, I'm an aggro player, I do X or whatever. And I think it's a very easy thing to fall into. Early on, you might have something you really like as a play style that's more fun than other things, but it's important to really expand your range. And what I always tell people is it is okay to have things that you prefer over other things, right? So, like, let's say for the sake of this example, you really like playing aggro decks. It's fine to have a preference towards playing aggro decks, but I think it's important to challenge yourself if your goal is to compete and really improve. And I'm assuming with the context of this question, that is, your goal. If your goal is just to have fun or always play the decks that you want to play and do the best you can with those, then for sure ignore this question. But if your goal is to really, expand your range, try playing other things and work on them. Because if you always play the same type of thing because it's like your comfort pick where you're biased towards, it's going to be really hard to improve, right? If you don't play tournaments where you're out of your comfort zone, you're never going to do better. You're never going to grow in those real ways because you just have to play in high stakes situations with things you aren't familiar with. And that's sort of my advice is, push yourself and make sure that you're not just defaulting to aggro because you love aggro. Maybe you also love tempo decks because they can be kind of similar and you should like explore that sort of archetype, but really branch out and just force yourself to get out of your comfort zone. Very similar to, you're at a bar or a social setting and you force yourself to go talk to somebody that you don't really know, and it typically works out pretty well. It will typically work out pretty well in Magic.
I think that's wonderful that you're encouraging people to just go to people at bars, Mason.
Yeah, that's what I do.
Love that.
I just talk to anybody. Everyone's my friend until they're not.
That's crazy. You're built different. Anyway, how to get out of that? Like, for me, from pretty early on in my Magic career, prided myself on, like, not doing this. For a bit, I was like, oh, I'm like a control player. And then I think it was when I read Next Level Magic and started to, and like, who's the beatdown, especially, like, that concept of, like, someone being the aggressor and someone having inevitability and being the one who is not the beatdown of, like, oh, it doesn't, like, the dynamics in a matchup, someone is going to be is going to have to be that aggro player, or, like, sometimes your draw, even in a very controlling deck, is going to mean that you should be prioritizing this kind of outcome for the game. Or, like, oh, resources are going to be more scarce and I need to play for a bit more value, so maybe I should be playing a bit more mid-rangey. And I think especially as the lines have blurred with how powerful the cards are, it's easier and easier to kind of shake yourself out of it, but it's also more and more damaging to only think of things one way because your cards can do so much. And, like, that mindset of being someone who's like, oh, I'm an aggro player, I only play mono red or whatever, or, like, I only play blue white control or control decks in general, like, I'm going to be Shaheen Sarani. That you have to recognize comes at such a cost. Even Shaheen, Shaheen played mono red at a pro tour that I was at with him. And, like, would he have liked to play a control deck? Sure. Was he going to let that change his mind off of playing a deck he thought was the best deck for the tournament? No. At that level, absolutely not. And, that mindset really comes from kind of reducing the experience, the play experience of Magic and the things you're trying to learn and exhibit in Magic down to just one way of looking at it. And the way to get out of that is to expand your mindset and open your mind to the fact that, I've played mono red, like, aggro decks like I'm the control player in mirror matches sometimes. I've played control decks like I'm the aggro player in combo matchups sometimes. I've played, combo decks like I'm mid-range decks when I, am not going to really be able to pull off my creature combo sometimes. All decks in some way can play, or not all, maybe not literally every deck, but most decks that you play at a tournament can play in multifaceted ways. And that's just, like, something you have to understand. And once you do, it's so much easier to untie your identity from that and untie how you see yourself as a Magic player from that, and really just embrace that you're someone who, you know, plays decks and plays formats and plays games and tries to win them. So that's how I see it anyway. It might not be really good actionable advice of like getting on the mindset, but it's, you know, you just got to shake it. You got to just, you know, get out of your comfort zone, like Mason's saying, and pick up a deck that isn't what it is you normally do, and try to apply those same skills that you have from playing a bunch of, you know, mono red aggro or playing Boy Control, and applying it to those decks to see how they do or don't convert, and just learn.
Hopefully that was helpful, Searing Blaze. I think the fact that you're asking that question in and of itself, if that's something you're maybe struggling with, is a good sign. You know what I mean? So hopefully it goes well, and hopefully that was helpful for you. You can check out our sponsor, untap.gg. There's a link in the show. It's completely free to use the base service. There is a premium one that you can check out on their website with lots of good services. But at the baseline, you download that and it will track your deck while you play on Arena. It will tell you what's left. You can also turn on a little feature where you can see the cards your opponents played. So maybe in game 2, we'll have sort of like, let's say, you know, Up the Beanstalk on the right. That's the only card they played game 1. You killed them really quickly. You're mono red. Wow, it shows your little list, which is something you could do in paper if you took notes, but can be very helpful, especially if you're maybe just getting into a format, to have that card right there in front of you, very easy to read. So make sure to check out untapped.gg. Link in the show notes and description wherever the podcast is found. And Abe, it is time for the main point of the show, always improving. It's something we talk about every week. If you're not working on improving and sort of doing that, you know, you're kind of staying stagnant. And we really like to always have that improvement mindset here on the show. So Abe, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so this week most of my Magic was like front loaded because I've been moving. I got keys to my place like yesterday at the time of recording. So earlier in the week, I was helping some friends prepare for their RCQs. Some of them were playing the Mana Traders in the showcase, and we're talking about, you know, what's important and really going over standard. So at first it was just playing more and more of the things that they weren't playing, even though I had no immediate stake in the format. And some of that thankfully overlapped with what we talked about in last week's episode of, I know Mason, you and I had both said that mono red was a deck that interested us, but maybe we hadn't had time to really put the hours into like a build and understanding like which one is best. But I was able to do some of that, and also like starting to talk over like in the terms of play patterns, like what's emerging, what's causing, like what are the draws to some of the different decks that are pretty similar, like for playing blue black mid range versus playing green black, for example, is something I talked about with one of my teammates. And you know, just really digging into more and more of the format that is in standard, and building out that understanding, and really starting to work with not just what decks are performing well, but what are the card choices in those, and kind of like being that sounding board for some of those, as someone who's really been focusing on understanding those play patterns.
I like that. My always improving actually does tie into mono red. I put in all caps on our show note, mono red. I finally got into playing it, and I've been really impressed. You know, I think I mentioned on the show last week that like I wouldn't be surprised if one of these like red decks in standard isn't just the best deck with how mana efficient it is. And, you know, ended up playing someone locally who at our store champs who was playing mono red with like a transformational sideboard, and kind of really liked that idea, basically of like, I'm going to cut like my monstrous rages and some of my like more anemic creatures against these like black decks, especially when I'm on the draw, and just sort of bulk up on things like Koth and Urbrest Forge and more removal, and sort of strand you with a bunch of kill spells in hand, and I'm going to grind you out. Tried that and like a transformational sideboard with that, still having everything with mono red. I really liked it, and it was really helpful improving of just like I have played a decent amount of mono red over my life. Like it is definitely the archetype I would say I've played the least, but really kind of pushed into it. Tried more than just that, but have really liked it, and really liking Mono Red in particular for standard as a quick aside of just like how powerful Rockface Village is, and just having these like clean plans. I know a lot of people had a lot of success with Gruul over the weekend. That being said, a very similar list where I'm describing won both the showcase and one of the online challenges. So, Mono Red's definitely no slouch, but there's still a lot of experimentation on kind of like what some of your last cards are going to be. Are you going to play cards like Bullet Wave or not? And yeah, I've been really impressed, and it's been really cool to kind of play a lot of games with Mono Red.
Mason, if you were not already adopting that plan against Green Black, I fear for what that matchup feels like for you. Like that. Like, and I do think it's something that's pretty unintuitive. Like, if you're someone who is just now getting interested in playing Mono Red and has not played a red deck before and didn't know that you were legally allowed to take 1-drops out of your deck when you sideboard, you are. You are. I think it's really awesome to see that things like that are happening and in like deck building, and also it's interesting to see like how the mid-range decks either do or don't adapt, and whether or not that remains the best approach, right? If they start cutting down their removal spells because they realize that it's actually about answering Rest Forges and Planeswalkers, then suddenly they're gonna not have nearly as many Doomblades and cut downs, and like the second you see a 3 cut down green black deck or blue black deck, 3 cut down in the 75, I don't know, you can just rethink everything. you can start saying I want to like actually just make the game about the early game, and it's pretty exciting stuff. I think that's like where standard gets to be kind of the coolest and best format, but it's really awesome to see. I love Mono Red.
Yeah, Sunspine Links too, by the way, I didn't mention that one. That card also just like absolute house of just like, oh, you're trying to play some like non-basics or whatever, especially out of decks like Domain or Blue Black where they have a bit more because they have the Verge, and you just kind of like nug them for 4 or whatever, and sometimes it turns off the Shieldred or other miscellaneous life gain stuff. It's just chef's kiss on, kind of a great experience. So yeah, it's been great. I've been really impressed, and yeah, it's awesome. That's going to do it for this week's episode. If you enjoyed the show, you're going to want to check out our YouTube channel. You can watch the show live in the future, or the pre-recorded VOD. It's going to be CCMTG on YouTube. You can also check us out on Twitter and Blue Skies at CCMTG. And you can check out the Patreon, patreon.com/CCMTG. The show will always be free, but if you enjoy the content and found some value, you want to give back a little bit, it'd be greatly appreciated. Abe, if someone wants to find you, where can they go?
You can find me over on Blue Sky. My username there is More Nothings. You can just search me up. I'm also on a few starter packs. You might already find me there. You can also, if you are, you can find me on Twitter. I do have my accounts there, and you can still DM me for coaching, or just send me an email at morenothings@gmail.com. Just put coaching in the description, and I would love to connect and figure out what we can do. How about you, Mason?
You can find me on Twitter and Blue Skies at Mason E. Clark. You can find me at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark, and you can reach out to me with coaching via either of those platforms or my email, masoniclark@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening to this week's episode, and we'll be back next week for another episode of CCMTG.